الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالحق بشيرا ونذيرا بين يدي الساعة من يطع الله ورسوله فقد رشد واهتدى ومن يعصهما فإنه قد غوى وإنه لا يضر إلا نفسه ولا يضر الله شيئا إن خير الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن خير الأمور عوازمها وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد يا أيها الذين آمنوا ادخلوا في السلم كافة ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين أما بعد فالسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا إذ جاءوكم من فوقكم ومن أسفل منكم وإذ زاغت الأبصار وبلغت القلوب الحناجر وتظنون بالله الظنونا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions or commands us, the ones who have belief, iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remember a certain event. And the ayah says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. So it's not restricted to the Sahaba, the ones who were at this event, but rather it's speaking to us, a timeless Quran, speaking to all the Muslims at all times. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu dhkuru ni'matallahi alaykum. Remember the ni'mah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with, or blessed this ummah with. إِذْ جَاءَتْكُمْ جُنُودٌ فَأَرْسَلْنَا. When soldiers came to you, so we sent. And we sent this wind. And we sent soldiers that you were not able to see. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was for sure able to see what you were doing. إِذْ جَاءُوكُم مِّن فَوْقِكُمْ وَمِنْ أَسْفَلَ مِنكُم. And when they came from above you, and when they came from below you, وَإِذْ زَاغَتِ الْأَبْصَارُ وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبُ الْحَنَاجِرُ. And when the eyes deviated. The word zayg in Arabic means to deviate, right? Like for example, the common dua you always make, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا. Oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask you to not deviate our hearts from the right path after you've guided us. إِذْ زَاغَتِ الْأَبْصَارُ. The eyes didn't even want to look at this event that was coming, of these soldiers coming from below, the soldiers coming from above, the soldiers coming in the eyes of the Sahaba and the eyes of the Munafiqeen, as we'll see, had very different reactions, but they both didn't want to look from the tremendous trial that was befalling them. وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبُ الْحَنَاجِرُ. And when the hearts reached all the way to the throats. The hearts reached all the way to the throats. So from the tremendous trial, the tremendous fear with this event, the hearts reached the throats. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end mentions that, and some of you, تَظُنُّونَ بِاللَّهِ ظُنُونَ, that you have a belief about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it mentions ظُنُونَ, that some kind of opinion about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see in the tafsir that it came in a general form because it encompasses the reaction of the mu'mineen, of the Sahaba, radwanullahi alayhim, and the munafiqeen, the ones who had a very opposite reaction. And when we study this reaction, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala details it very clearly, وَلَمَّا رَأَى الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الْأَحْزَابَ قَالُوا هَذَا مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَصَدَقَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. That when these believers saw what was coming, they said, هَذَا مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَصَدَقَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. That verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam had command, or had told you already that this was coming. And this event that we're speaking about is the Battle of Al-Ahzab, Al-Khandaq. When Abu Sufyan, in collaboration with other from the Jewish tribes and also from the Arab tribes, essentially sieged Medina. And this was a time or a battle that truly shook the people of Medina to the core. But the Muslims, when they saw this battle, when they saw the enemy approaching, when all you could see in front of you was death, their reaction was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam have told the truth. وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. And that the only thing that increased in their hearts is iman, in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas before, we see the munafiqeen had a very, very, very different reaction. وَإِذْ يَقُولُ, and this is before, right after the ayat I just recited. وَإِذْ يَقُولُ الْمُنَافِقُونَ وَالَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ وإذ يقول المنافقون والذين في قلوبهم مرض ما وعدنا الله ورسوله إلا غرورا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the conjecture or the doubt these munafiqeen have in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They said that when they saw this huge army, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam have only promised them ghurura, which is deception, right? And shaitan in the Quran is called al-gharur. وَلَا يَغُرَّنَّكُمْ بِاللَّهِ الْغَرُورِ, right? That shaitan should not deceive you about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reason why I mention this event and why I'm mentioning the different reactions that we see from these two parties, ones who were true believers, Sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and then others who were munafiqeen, the ones who, when the trial came to them, they failed that test, is because there's a key to this, a very important key that is important for us to know, so that when we are faced with similar events in our lives, in events that we're going through right now, in events that we see our Muslim brothers and sisters passing those tests, the same way the Sahaba did, we have to have that same reaction. But to have that same reaction, we have to learn what is that key, what is that treasure, what is that concept that allows someone to see death, to see trial, to see tribulation, to see no way out, and to say that this is for sure what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam promised us, and we're happy, and we increase in iman, and we increase in submission. The key to this is this idea of spirituality, or this idea of ruhaniyya. And this is the topic of my khutbah today, inshallah. A lot of us, we have a misconception, or we can say a flawed understanding of what ruhaniyya is, of what spirituality is. When I mention ruhaniyya, typically the person will think of like someone who's very spiritual, someone who, in this context, meaning he stays away from dunya, someone who is constantly in a state of ibadah, someone who's constantly worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning in salah, etc. And we have a very non-foundational understanding to spirituality. So I want to read from an article, the meaning of spirituality in Islam. الروحانية في الإسلام ليست مجرد مشاعر غريزية. The ruhaniyya in Islam, spirituality in Islam, it's not just instinctual emotions that one feels. It's not a spiritual high in that sense. It's not something that you feel in your heart without, that's just instinctual. بل هي ناتجة عن إدراك عقلي للصلة بالله. That actually it is coming from, or it's a result of إدراك عقلي للصلة بالله, a foundational understanding or a recognition of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here this means the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Iman fil Islam yaqumu ala al-aql. That al-Iman in Islam, faith in Islam, is based on the mind, right? For the brothers and sisters who are involved in, we have a dawah booth over here, a lot of your conversation with atheists and even Christians as well, a lot of it is to do with the role of the mind in recognizing objective truth. Trying to explain to them that, for example, a lot of Christians will come with these crazy stories, right? That they had a dream and they saw Jesus and therefore they believe in Christianity. Or they were saved by someone who was Christian and therefore they adopted Christianity. Or things that are based off of an emotional idea, not a foundational idea rooted in the mind, in a rational process to come to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وليس على المشاعر وحدها, and it cannot be on only the emotions. لأن الاعتماد على المشاعر فقط قد يؤدي إلى الانحراف والضلال. Because depending on emotions only could lead to deviation and misguidance. And when we pause right here and we look back at the story that I mentioned, that these hypocrites who had believed in Medina, it was out of a benefit, a worldly benefit, and because of their emotions, seeing the Muslims around them and seeing how the status of a Muslim in society was sanctified, therefore they believed. And that's why, for those who have read the seerah, we see that munafiqeen did not exist, hypocrites did not exist in Mecca, but they exist in Medina. In Medina, why? Because in Medina it was easy to be Muslim. In Medina it was looked up to be Muslim. In Medina it was praised to be Muslim. So therefore, when the moment in time came that their iman was tested, when the moment in time came when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent soldiers from above and below them, their response to was what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us ghurura, He's promised us deception. So if iman is not founded, and our spirituality is not founded in this understanding of our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we're going to be flipping during the times that struggle comes. In another part of the article it mentions, وَلِذَلِكَ كَانَ وَاجِبًا عَلى الْمُسْلِمْ أَنْ يَجْعَلَ قُوَّتَهُ هي القوة الروحية فهي كنزه الذي لا يفنى وهي سر نجاحه وانتصاره. In that, therefore, the Muslim, it's obligatory upon him to derive his strength or to put his strength and to get it from spirituality, from ar-ruhaniyya, because it is the treasure that never ends and it is the secret to his success and his victory. So look at the beauty of these words. Look at how such a simple concept that I'm sure we all learned when we were kids applies to such a big, huge event. An event where people passed this test and people failed this test. Where people were faced with this question of, do I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of a spiritual high it gives me? Or when I try to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is it through attempting to have a spiritual high? Or is it from contemplating on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to gain an understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, who is Al-Aziz, who is Al-Ghafur, who is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. When I understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, when I understand my rizq is in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my provision is in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when I understand my ajal, my lifespan is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when I have tawakkul and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when I have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when I can get this reaction and get this reward that the Sahaba got. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he mentions the hadith where he says, أَشَدُّ النَّاسِ بِلَاءِ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ ثُمَّ الْأَمْثَلُ فِي الْأَمْثَلِ. That verily the ones who are tested the most are the prophets, then the next best and the next best. So when we study these and read the Quran, and the Quran commands us to remember these struggles, these hard times for the Muslims, the reason why is so that we reflect upon our own lives. That when we face struggles, what is our reaction? And to make it relevant, to make this idea of defining spirituality very clearly as the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in understanding your position as a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To make it relevant, the most clear example we see right now is the fear that we face with the new president. looking at Trump and not just his activities domestically, but even looking at his idea that he's been pushing very hard for the past week of تهجير أهل Gaza, to push out the people of Gaza, to push them towards, he mentioned Egypt or Jordan. When we look at this example, right, the heart feels sad. You feel a sense sometimes maybe even of hopelessness. You might even feel that, how can this be happening? But when we look at the reaction of the people of Gaza, we're going to see very, very, very clearly the lesson in spirituality they teach us and the words a mu'min is supposed to be saying in the situation. And it'll more than suffice to learn this lesson from the children of Gaza. These are children, and maybe no more than 10 years old. To give you just two quotes. This is a video of someone, she says, "Hello dear President Trump, I am the child Maria Hannoun from Gaza. I want to ask you a question, and I hope it reaches you and you answer me. As a child survivor of the Gaza war, if I asked you to leave your home and your land and live in Egypt or China, would you accept that? I'm sorry for laughing, but in reality, you won't accept that. If you yourself would refuse that, why would you want to force me to accept for me to live outside of my house and leave my land? Aren't you supposed to be the country of the freedom that carries freedom in the world? Which freedom are you all talking about? When you want to restrict us in our homeland in diaspora, my advice to the President of the world, you can control the whole world except for Gaza, because Gaza is the whole world." This is a child, brothers and sisters. This is someone who hasn't sat down and memorized mutun of aqidah. This is not someone who sat down and gone through the seerah of Rasulullah in depth and went through a 5-year degree. This is not someone who sat and had to learn how to get a spiritual high to connect themselves with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to have a proper reaction of a mu'min. But this simple concept, which is the goal of this khutbah today, is understanding that this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to see in every part of our lives. We have to. The basis for our thinking and our actions has to be the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And once that thinking is founded in the aqidah of Islam, then we'll be able to make these courageous stands that the children of Gaza are showing us how to do. And to mention one last quote. أنا لا أفتخر بغزة وأنا ابنها فلست لغير الإسلام أنتسب فلا غزة ولا فلسطين ولا قدسها ولا مكة تقدس الإنسان ولا نسب إنما يقدس كل نفس عملها ذلك عند الله يحتسب. So this child is saying that I do not أفتخر, that I'm not prideful or arrogant that I'm from, because of Gaza, even though I'm from Gaza. فلست لغير الإسلام أنتسب, because I only ascribe myself to Islam. Other than that, I don't ascribe myself to anything else. فلا غزة ولا فلسطين ولا قدسها, nor Gaza, nor Philistine, nor sanctity, nor Al-Quds. ولا مكة تقدس الإنسان ولا نسب, nor even Mecca al-Mukarramah. This does not sanctify or make someone righteous or make someone great and make his lineage great. إنما يقدس كل نفس عملها. Verily, the only thing that can uplift a person, the only thing that can increase in karamah, increase him in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is his actions. ذلك عند الله يحتسب. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will count. So this question has been on our minds for the past week of Trump trying to push away the people of Gaza into Jordan or Egypt, and of course seeing the continuous betrayal of the Muslim rulers. This is something that our reaction should be like the people of Gaza themselves. A reaction rooted in spirituality. Spirituality, brothers and sisters, as we saw with the Sahaba, as we saw with the Muslims in Gaza, is something that is a foundation for all of our actions and all of our thinking. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In another ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this ayah was revealed in the context of Uhud, speaking about some of the martyrs in Uhud, like Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib radiyallahu anhu, and Mus'ab bin Umair radiyallahu anhu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. From the believers, there are men, they stay true to their covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَضَى نَحْبَهُ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَنْتَظِرُ. And among them, there are those who they held true to their covenant until death. For example, Mus'ab bin Umair, Hamza bin Abd al-Muttalib, they died in Uhud. They didn't get to see Islam get to where it's at now. They didn't get to see the success or the fruits of their work. But they were true to the covenant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until death. And among them also, these ones who are true to their covenant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from these mu'mineen, the ones who are true believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are those who are waiting. They are waiting for what? To fulfill their covenant until the death. The same way the Sahaba did. وَمَا بَدَّلُوا تَبْدِيلًا. And here if we focus, the ayah mentions that never in any situation did they ever see that something else was more beneficial. They never swapped the covenant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for anything else. And this idea again is rooted in the idea of spirituality. If we have, like I mentioned in the beginning, an incorrect understanding of spirituality being something that we take as a spiritual high, or we see as I'm religious when I go to the masjid, or I feel this high when I go in pray salah. If that's all our iman has to offer us in terms of spirituality, we need to review our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do I truly understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me and created the situation around me? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the circumstances I'm in? If we don't understand this, then we won't be able to have these reactions, these courageous reactions that we see from the Sahaba radwanullahi alayhim, and also the people of Gaza. And I'll end off with an ayah that summarizes this and packages it very beautifully. And it's an ayah we all know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ, the ones who they were told by the people, قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ, the people have gathered against you, so be scared of them, have fear of them. فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا, so instead what happened? They increased in iman. The same way the believers on the day of Al-Khandaq, on the day of Al-Ahzab, when they were sieged by 10,000 soldiers, they reacted with increasing their iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and submitting themselves to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. And they responded, and what was the reaction to the events? They said, Allah surely is sufficient for us, and He is the best protector. If we contemplate about these words, it's an ayah we've heard multiple times, but if we contemplate about this, it takes a lot of preparation to be able to say these words in times of difficulty. It's easy for me to say this right now, sitting over here, and it's easy for us to read this ayah because we're comfortable. But when the time comes where we have to live by this ayah, when the time comes where we have to truly embody Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel, we have to prepare for that. And inshallah, with Ramadan coming up, this must be our goal. It must be our goal to review ourselves and renew this covenant we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and make sure that Ramadan does not come as a spiritual high. It does not come as a moment or a brief month of spiritual high, of salah, of i'tikaf, of ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then after Ramadan we turn back to how we were before. This has to be very, very clear in our minds. And I'll end off with one last point, inshallah. The beginning of the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu ittaqillah. If we just pause right there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, ittaqillah, have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How many of us, when we're told that statement, we're like, what do you mean? You tell me to have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are you insulting me? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the best of creation, ittaqillah, وَلَا تُطِعِ الْكَافِرِينَ وَالْمُنَافِقِينَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرًا. And do not follow the kuffar or the munafiqeen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all knowledgeable of what you do. So if Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was reminded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're min bab awla, it's more important, or we're more befitting, we're more in need of this reminder, of course, than Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So please, let's take this as a moment to reflect on ourselves, reflect on our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That with iyadu billah, if we were put in this situation, would we be from the ones who are in the camp who are saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deceived us, iyadu billah? Or would we be from the ones who have built ourselves spiritually, who have attained true spirituality, who have rooted every single thought and concept we have in the aqidah of Islam, so that inshaAllah we are from the people who are among the Sahaba and among those who are true to their covenant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulil ameen, amma ba'd, faya ma'ashar al-muslimin, a'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan ar-rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا مولانا محمد بعدد من صلى وصام اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد بعدد من قعد وقام اللهم صل على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى سائر الصحابة والتابعين ومن اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم أيد الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم انصر من نصر دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم واجعلنا منهم واخذل من خذل دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا تجعلنا منهم اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم ثبتنا على الإسلام اللهم نور قلوبنا بنور الإيمان اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة اللهم إنا نسألك أن ترحمنا وأن ترحم إخواننا في غزة ربنا إنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين اللهم استخدمنا ولا تستبدلنا يا رب العالمين اللهم استخدمنا ولا تستبدلنا يا رب العالمين اللهم استخدمنا ولا تستبدلنا يا رب العالمين اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأذل الشرك والمشركين ودمر أعداء الدين يا رب العالمين عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله تعالى أعلى